Welcome to today's historical deep dive, where we dissect the choices that forge or fracture legends. Today, we step inside the mind of a man who redrew the map of Europe with a pen dipped in gunpowder. If you love immersive, real storytelling about ambition and downfall, hit like and subscribe. It helps us more than you know. Drop a comment with your favorite Napoleon quote, or the moment that shocked you most. Let's begin and change the way you think about history. You stand on the eastern bank of the Niemen River, June 1812. The air hums with an electric anticipation that vibrates through the soles of your boots. Before you, a vast, wild horizon stretches into the misty promise of a Russian summer, seemingly empty, beckoning. Behind you, massed on the western bank, is the Grande Armée, 500,000 men, a babel of tongues, the largest military force ever assembled by one mind. Cannons gleam under a sky heavy with portent, banners snap sharply in the breeze, and the collective heartbeat of Europe's mightiest empire throbs with impatient energy. This is the culmination of years of relentless will, of victories that defied logic, of a trajectory that seemed to bend reality itself to your command. You are Napoleon, Emperor of the French, King of Italy, Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine. You feel invincible. Your star is not just ascendant, it seems fixed as the brightest in the firmament. Your will, you believe, is the very forge upon which history is hammered into shape. The continental system, your grand economic weapon against Britain, must be absolute, its blockade ironclad. Alexander I of Russia's defiance cannot stand. He must be brought to heel, made to understand that Parisian decree is continental law. This final vast step eastward feels less like an invasion and more like a coronation, a solidification of your absolute dominance over the continent. You gaze out at the virgin territory, a vast empty canvas awaiting the stroke of your genius. But look closer. See the subtle shimmer on that distant horizon? The way the light bends, the way the air seems to swallow sound? That's not just distance, playing tricks on the eye. That is the beginning of vastness, a scale of emptiness, of indifference, a scale of enemy you have never truly comprehended. For all your mastery of battalions and battle lines, you have never faced an adversary whose greatest strength is simply existing across an infinite space, a space that can absorb armies whole. This moment of supreme power, audacious entry, and absolute confidence is also the genesis of your greatest unraveling. It is the point where ambition crosses the threshold from world-building mastery into self-defeating hubris, believing reality must bend to your will because it always has before. Ask yourself, was this the strategic calculation of a master, or the desperate gamble of a man who had begun to believe his own mythology? The ground trembles, not just from the marching feet of 500,000 men, but with the faint, distant tremor of a consequence you cannot yet hear, a consequence meted out by forces far larger than armies. You are stepping into the void where genius meets its limit, and the sheer, brutal indifference of scale and nature begins to assert its own undeniable power. The great army, the Grande Armée, a shimmering tide of 500,000 souls and 1,000 cannon, surges across the Niemen River. You are at its head, eyes fixed eastward, towards Moscow. The air hums, not just with the tramp of boots and the rumble of wagons, but with a palpable, intoxicating confidence. This campaign, you tell yourself, tell your marshals, will be different from the grind in Spain. This will be swift, decisive, glorious. You recall the early days, the exhilarating speed of the initial advance, scattering hesitant Russian outposts like leaves before a gale. Your marshals, men forged in the fires of your victories, Davout, Ney, Murat, feel it too. Oh, some harbor quiet anxieties about the vastness of the land, the logistics, the sheer scale. But the prevailing mood, the pervasive belief, is that this war will be over by autumn. A decisive battle or two, the kind you orchestrate with unmatched brilliance, shattering the enemy line, dictating terms in Moscow or St. Petersburg, and then home, before the first snow dares to fall. You, more than anyone, expect a pitched battle. You crave it. That is your canvas, the arena where your strategic genius truly shines, where you can trap, outflank, and utterly destroy an army in a single, brutal day. But history, that sly old jester, often refuses to play by the conqueror's rules. This early confidence, this expectation of a swift, decisive clash, reveals a critical leadership blind spot, expecting your enemy to fight your war. The Russians weren't offering the glorious set-piece battles you craved. They weren't playing chess where you expected them to sacrifice pawns for tempo. They were melting away like specters, trading space for time, luring you deeper into the endless, silent plains. Every village you reach is empty, every supply depot burned. The land itself becomes the enemy, vast and unforgiving. You push forward, convinced they must eventually stand and fight, convinced your method, proven on a dozen fields of glory, will ultimately force their hand. This unwavering conviction, this clinging to the familiar strategy, is where the insight lies. True strategic mastery isn't just about winning battles you understand. It's about understanding the nature of the conflict you are in, even when it is unconventional, even when it frustrates your every expectation. Ask yourself, was this steadfastness brilliance, the unshakable will of a commander who knows his own power? Or was it already the first chilling whisper of hubris? Success can, paradoxically, breed rigidity. When your favorite hammer doesn't work on the problem before you, clinging to it while the enemy uses a different, unseen tool is not perseverance. It's a path to disaster. You were so sure of your method, so certain that your reputation alone would compel the Russians to stand and fight, that you failed to see their strategy unfolding like a slow, deliberate, inescapable trap, baited with empty land and the promise of a winter you were not prepared for. The ground you gain feels increasingly hollow, each step forward a further commitment to a war that is not the one you came to fight. The endless plains stretch before you, a vast, indifferent canvas under a sky growing colder. You march deeper into this immensity, but the expected resources, the vital pulse of sustenance for a grand army, simply vanish. Villages stand silent, hollowed out, smoke still curling lazily from where roofs were. Fields are blackened scars, the earth deliberately wounded. Wells, the ancient sources of life, are choked or poisoned, spitting back death where thirst craved water. A very land seems to conspire, a passive, implacable enemy mirroring the retreating foe. This isn't a strategic maneuver you can outflank or a cavalry charge you can shatter. This is a war against emptiness, a battle against absence. The promised supplies, struggling over the obscene distances behind you, find nothing when they finally arrive. They are ghosts searching for substance that has been purposefully erased. Men begin to starve, their faces gaunt, their eyes losing the light of conquest, replaced by a desperate animal hunger. Horses, the engines of your swift war machine, collapse in their tracks, their breath ragged, their strength consumed by the desolate miles. Discipline, that iron framework forged in victory, begins to fray at the edges. The Grand Army, the terror of Europe, is reduced to scavenging. Soldiers break ranks, turning from conquerors into desperate pilgrims, scrabbling for roots, for discarded scraps, for anything that will quiet the gnawing emptiness within. You see it, the subtle insubordination, the loss of the sharp military bearing, replaced by the slumped shoulders of simple survival. This wasn't in the plans drawn up in gilded palaces. Here lies a harsh, brutal lesson in logistics, a stark reminder of the absolute limits of projecting power without securing your base. Your brilliant strategic mind, the one that could dismantle empires with a flourish, is held hostage by practical realities. A lack of food, a shortage of water, the sheer, unyielding distance stretching back to civilization. It's a truth often obscured by the thunder of cannons and the glory of banners. Neglecting the mundane, the logistical, the boring details of wagons and supply depots, particularly at the colossal scale you operate, can doom the most ambitious, most certain grand plan. This is perhaps the most tragic irony unfolding on these plains. Genius doesn't feed your army. Planning, patience, and vast quantities of mundane supplies do. Look around you, at the starving faces, the dying horses, the empty horizon. Was the initial decision to march into this void an act of supreme confidence rooted in past success, or a blindness to the fundamental laws of physics and sustenance? What would you prioritize now, seeing the very foundation of your power, your army's belly, crumble beneath you? You look back at the reports. Hundreds of thousands of men started this march, a river of steel and ambition flowing east. But where are they now? The vast columns that cross the Niemen River, a force seemingly unstoppable, have thinned dramatically. Sickness, born of poor sanitation and unfamiliar diets, gnaws at the ranks. Desertion, a quiet, persistent drain, claims thousands more. Men who simply cannot bear the endless roads, the lack of supplies, the sheer, grinding futility of marching into the unknown. The relentless demands of distance, eating away at morale, food, and equipment, have already culled the ranks significantly. The Grande Armée, while still immense on paper, is a shadow of the vibrant force that began this invasion. Yet, you push on. Your gaze is fixed, unwavering, on the ultimate prize, Moscow, the ancient capital, the heart of Mother Russia. You believe capturing it will break the Tsar's will, force him to the negotiating table, bring this seemingly endless campaign to a decisive, glorious end. The initial power projection was staggering, the sheer number of soldiers a weapon in itself. But the reality on the ground tells a different story. The strength you measure is no longer the initial census, it is the sustainable force, the men who can still march, still fight, still endure. This section underscores the deceptive nature of sheer numbers when those numbers are eroding and unsupported. It is easy, exhilarating even, to focus on the initial power projection, the spectacle of such a massive force. But the real strength of an army, of any enterprise, is its sustainable power, its resilience, its logistical backbone, its capacity to endure depletion and still function. The leadership insight here is a profound, tragic one. Ignoring attrition or believing your mission is so utterly vital it will somehow override basic human needs, the laws of supply, and the realities of decay is not strategic thinking. It is a form of self-deception, a gambler's fallacy writ large across a continent. The reflection settles like the dust on a long march. True power isn't just the size of the force you gather at the outset, the flash and thunder of assembly. It is the mundane, difficult, ceaseless work of maintaining that force, of sustaining it, of keeping it effective in the face of brutal reality. An army without shoes in freezing temperatures, without food in barren lands, without morale eroded by endless hardship, is not an army. It is just a crowd waiting to freeze, surrender, or simply melt away. You see the thinning ranks, the weary faces, but the destination glitters brighter in your mind than the reality underfoot. Was this unwavering focus the mark of visionary leadership or the blind spot of fatal hubris? You stand on the battlefield at Borodino, September 7th, 1812. The air is thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. The ground churned into a bloody mire underfoot. Cannons roar incessantly, a deafening, relentless thunderclap, as infantry lines clash in brutal, close-quarters combat. Cavalry charges break like desperate waves against rock, leaving behind a horrific tide mark of dead and dying. This is the battle you sought, a confrontation of unprecedented scale and savagery, a grinder designed to crush the enemy's will and army. At the end of the brutal day, the silence, when it comes, is not peace, but exhaustion. The Russians retreat, fading into the vastness of their homeland, leaving you in possession of a field strewn with nearly 80,000 casualties from both sides. You claim victory. Flags are raised, dispatches sent. The Tsar's army has been forced to yield ground. But look closer, beyond the captured cannons and the ravaged landscape. Look at the cost. Your veteran soldiers, the Iron Corps that marched across Europe, are gone. They are replaced by raw conscripts, still wide-eyed with terror, and the gaunt, exhausted survivors of this meat grinder. The Grand Army, the instrument of your will, is severely blunted, and the Russian army, though battered, it is not destroyed. It has merely withdrawn, preserving its vital core, its strategic depth immense. This victory is a poisoned chalice, crippling your own force as much as, or arguably more than, the enemy's. It is not a step forward towards decisive conquest, but a lurch towards exhaustion, a grim forecast of battles to come with diminishing strength. Here lies a stark, brutal lesson etched in blood and mud. Be wary of winning battles that cost you the war. Sometimes, the greatest discipline isn't the iron will to push forward at all costs, but the strategic wisdom of knowing when not to sacrifice everything for a tactical gain that doesn't yield ultimate decision. Recognize that true success isn't measured solely by ground taken or enemy dead on a single day, but by the strategic position you hold afterwards, the strength you retain. You won the field at Borodino. Yes, you drove the enemy back, but in doing so, you squandered the finite resource of your best men and lost the crucial chance for a truly decisive blow that could cripple Russia's ability to resist. It was a triumph of sheer willpower, perhaps, but strategically, it was a tragic miscalculation. Pause here. Standing in the ruins of this devastating success, what would you have done? Would you recognize the chilling cost? Or would the taste of victory blind you to the strategic peril? You ride into Moscow a week later, on September 14th, 1812. You expected resistance at the gates, perhaps a desperate last stand, or more likely, deputations of bowing officials offering the keys to the city, a formal surrender of the great prize. But instead, you find silence. A vast, silent city, stretching out before you like a slumbering giant, deserted, eerily, unnervingly empty. The gates stand open, unguarded, like a mouth agape in shock. You pass through streets that are bare, the grand palaces on either side hollow husks, their windows dark, their doors shut tight. This prize, the symbolic heart of Russia, the objective that drove you through frozen plains and bloody battles, has been abandoned. The people, the army, the court, they are gone. It is a victory devoid of triumph, a capture without a captive. This scene is a brutal, powerful metaphor for achieving a goal that turns out to be meaningless, or worse, actively harmful. You reached the destination you coveted above all others, but the point of reaching it evaporated the moment you arrived. The enemy did not meet you head-on. They sidestepped your strength, turned your victory into a void. This is the stark leadership insight. Sometimes, your enemy's greatest weapon is not fighting you on your terms, but forcing you into a situation you don't understand and cannot control. They didn't defend Moscow. They weaponized its emptiness. It forces a crushing moral takeaway. You must be absolutely certain you understand the true value of the objective you are pursuing, and be prepared for it to be radically different from what you imagine. What looks like a trophy on the horizon might just be an empty box when you grasp it, or, as you are about to discover here, a burning trap. The relief you might have felt, fleetingly, at entering an undefended city quickly sours into profound unease. You stand in the center of the enemy's capital, but you feel utterly exposed, lost in a strategic wilderness. You have won the city, yes, but you have lost control of the narrative, the initiative, and perhaps, though you refuse to admit it yet, the entire campaign. What would you have done, standing in his empty boots in this silent, expectant city? Were you conquering a prize, or merely stepping into a cage of your own making? The grand march east, culminating in this strange, hollow moment, reveals a Napoleon perhaps too fixed on symbols, too blind to the deeper currents of his enemy's resolve. He has captured the body, but the spirit has flown, leaving behind only the chilling silence. You ride into Moscow, expecting a conquered city, perhaps sullen but intact. But the air is thick with something else: smoke, the acrid scent of burning wood. You enter not a prize, but a tomb already being dug. Soon after your grand army's entry, small plumes become towering infernos. Fires erupt across Moscow with terrifying speed and coordination. They spread rapidly, consuming district after district, turning the beautiful wooden city into an uncontrollable blaze. Your soldiers, exhausted and already disillusioned, are trapped in a labyrinth of fire. Streets become impassable walls of flame. Headquarters are threatened, precious supplies devoured by the conflagration. This is no accident. It's a desperate, defiant act. The inhabitants, or those few left behind by Rostopchin's orders, seem determined to destroy their own capital, their own homes, rather than let you possess them. They torch their history, their wealth, their very city, offering it as a sacrifice on the altar of resistance. You watch from the Kremlin walls as the flames lick the sky, an unwanted crown of fire atop your supposed conquest. This is the stark reality of total resistance, the chilling willingness of an enemy to make sacrifices you perhaps could not conceive, sacrifices that lie utterly outside your strategic calculus, focused on armies and territory. It reveals, brutally, the limits of imposing your will when faced with an opponent whose spirit is so unyielding it would rather self-immolate than yield. This was Russia's chilling, definitive answer to your ambition. The conquest of Moscow was meant to be the glorious climax, the psychological breaking point for the Tsar. Instead, it became a poisoned chalice, a burning testament to a deeper resolve you had failed to measure. What would you have done, standing there amidst the rising heat and falling ash, realizing your grandest victory was a hollow shell? The leadership insight here is profound and painful. Power built solely on force is brittle when faced with an unyielding spirit rooted in culture and identity. You can capture territory, but you cannot conquer a spirit that prefers ash to subjugation. Understanding the depth of your enemy's resolve, their cultural values, and their willingness to suffer is as crucial, perhaps more crucial, than understanding their troop dispositions. Moscow burning wasn't just a military setback. It was a philosophical defeat. Weeks stretch into an eternity within the charred heart of Moscow. You are in the Kremlin, a conqueror, reigning over ashes and ruin. But the air grows thin, heavy with the smell of damp wood smoke and unspoken dread. Your court is established, a fragile island of French formality in a sea of Russian devastation. Every morning breaks with the same quiet expectation. Messengers ride east, carrying terms, ultimatums, veiled threats wrapped in offers of peace. You send them to Tsar Alexander I, your rival, your elusive prey, absolutely certain that the sight of your banners over his ancient capital will shatter his resolve. Surely, now he must sue for peace. And you wait, and wait. The days bleed into each other, marked only by the dying embers of the great fire and the chilling creep of the season. The grand halls of the Kremlin feel less like a palace and more like a gilded cage. The fire, which seemed like a final act of defiance, now reveals itself as a grim collaborator with time and distance, having destroyed the very resources your army needed to sustain itself. The scorched earth offers nothing. The first delicate, insidious snowflakes begin to fall, dusting the ruins, a beautiful herald of a terrible enemy, far more relentless than any Cossack. The air bites with a cold promise of winter's full fury. Still, there is no word from Alexander, only silence. He ignores your overtures, treats your messengers with indifference or outright disdain. He is not playing by the rules of the game you have mastered, the swift, decisive victory followed by the dictated peace. He is not defeated. He is simply absent. This silence is a weapon you have no defense against. You are stranded, deep in hostile territory, isolated not by distance alone, but by the Tsar's refusal to engage on your terms. Your supplies dwindle with each passing day. The Grande Armée, once invincible, feels the gnawing teeth of hunger and the crushing weight of dashed hopes. They shiver in inadequate uniforms as the snow falls harder. This prolonged, fatal inaction in a rapidly deteriorating situation is perhaps the starkest example of stubbornness born not just of pride, but of an almost mystical faith in your own historical inevitability. You genuinely believed that your physical presence in Moscow, your long history of forcing terms on defeated monarchs, would automatically compel Alexander to the negotiating table. You were wrong. Alexander, perhaps understanding you better than you understood yourself in this moment, refused to give you the satisfaction, the validation of a surrender. He chose instead the agonizing path of attrition, letting distance, climate, and his own people's sacrifice grind you down. The profound, tragic insight here is how past success can calcify into a dangerous rigidity. Your repeated triumphs, where opponents folded after suffering defeat, had trained you to expect a certain outcome. When that familiar strategy failed in the face of an unexpected adversary's tenacity, you were unable to pivot. You doubled down, waiting for the reality to conform to your expectation, rather than adapting to the harsh reality unfolding outside the Kremlin windows. This wasn't strategic patience. It was paralysis, a refusal to accept that the old map no longer matched the terrain. Doubling down on a failed approach, especially one driven by the belief that your status or destiny makes you immune to reversal, is a guaranteed path to ruin. Waiting for the enemy to conform to your expectations while your own situation unravels beneath you is not strategy. It is a profound failure of leadership. Consider the irony. The man who conquered Europe with lightning speed is brought to a standstill by silence and snow. The master of maneuver is trapped by his own static expectation. What would the young, adaptable General Bonaparte have done? He might have seen the danger, cut his losses, and retreated weeks earlier, preserving his army. But Emperor Napoleon, draped in the robes of invincibility, could not conceive of retreat without victory, and could not conceive of Alexander refusing defeat. It's a fatal blind spot. Ask yourself, in what areas of your own life, your own leadership, do you rely on past success to dictate future outcomes? Where are you waiting for the world to conform to your expectations instead of adapting to the reality it presents? What would you have done, standing in Napoleon's boots, feeling the chill of the first snow and the heavier chill of Alexander's silence? The wait in Moscow was not a pause. It was the beginning of the end. Every snowflake that fell was a step taken by disaster. The air bites with a cold that promises far worse. It is mid-October 1812. For weeks, perhaps months, you have lingered in Moscow, a hollow prize, a city burnt by its own people, offering no capitulation from Tsar Alexander, only silence and defiance carried on the wind. Every day of delay has been a nail hammered into the Grande Armée's coffin, visible now in the skeletal trees and the first dusting of snow. Finally, the undeniable reality crushes the lingering hope of negotiation. You, Napoleon, issue the order. Retreat. The decision hangs heavy, a lead weight replacing the emperor's golden crown. It is a retreat, yes, but initially framed as a strategic withdrawal, a movement towards better supply lines. The army, what remains of its once vaunted strength, begins to move. But it is not the swift, disciplined machine that marched into Russia. It is a slow, shuffling beast, burdened not just by the weight of miles ahead, but by the sheer, staggering volume of loot. Gold and silver, furs, fine silks, priceless art. Every soldier, officer, even the Imperial Guard, seems to have stuffed their packs with the treasures of a conquered city. This bounty, meant to symbolize victory, becomes an anchor, chaining the army to a snail's pace, a tragic testament to a victory that never truly was. Your hope, the strategist's last gasp, is to take a different route south towards Kaluga, through territory not yet ravaged by the war's consumption. This path promises forage, supplies, a chance for the weary men and horses to recover before winter descends in earnest. It is a calculated risk, bypassing known dangers for potential salvation. But history, or perhaps fate, often has a crueler trajectory. At the town of Maloroslavets, you encounter the Russian army. The ensuing battle is brutal, a close-fought, bloody affair that costs thousands of lives. You hold the field, technically a victory, but the price is too high, the path too heavily contested. The strategic door to the south slams shut. There is no choice now. The army must turn back onto the Smolensk road, the very route it took coming in, a route already stripped bare, a wasteland littered with the corpses of men and horses, abandoned wagons, and the ghosts of departed supplies. It is the path of devastation, now to be the path of desperation. This moment, the forced turn back onto the ruined road, marks the definitive shift. The campaign is no longer about conquering Russia. It is about surviving it. It is a race against the elements, against starvation, against the relentless harassment of Russian Cossacks and partisans, who now see the eagle not as a predator, but as wounded prey. The penalty for delayed decision-making is laid bare in every freezing breath, every collapsing soldier. You waited in Moscow, hoping, perhaps needing, Alexander to yield. The initial strategic brilliance that defined your career faltered here, replaced by a dangerous paralysis, a denial of the inevitable. The intelligence reports screamed of winter's approach, of the impossibility of living off the land in a land already devoured. Yet, you stayed. This reveals a profound truth about leadership, perhaps the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the most vital decision is admitting your original plan has failed and changing course, even if that admission feels like a humiliation, even if the alternative is costly. You can almost hear the chess pieces mocking you from the emperor's private chambers in Moscow. The move you should have made weeks ago, the pieces you refused to sacrifice. Ask yourself, in your own life, in your challenges, how often have you delayed the inevitable, hoping against hope that circumstances would change, that reality would bend to your will? The reflection here is stark and unforgiving. The cost of delaying an inevitable, difficult decision almost always outweighs the pain of making it promptly. Hesitation in the face of undeniable reality doesn't preserve options. It eliminates them, often leaving you with the worst possible choice: the ravaged road, the closing winter, the long, late retreat into the abyss. The greatest danger wasn't the enemy ahead, but the enemy of hope blinding you behind. Now, the price for that blindness will be paid in blood, ice, and the slow disintegration of the Grande Armée. The air bites with a new kind of cold. Not the crisp chill of autumn campaigns, but a deep, malevolent presence that sinks into bone and marrow. You watch as the vanguard reports conditions unlike any anticipated. Then it arrives. The Russian winter doesn't creep. It descends, a white avalanche of snow and plummeting temperatures that steals breath and hope with terrifying speed. The meticulously planned logistics, already stretched thin over the vast distances, snap like frozen twigs. Wagons loaded with vital supplies are buried, immobilized in drifts that appear overnight. Roads become treacherous ribbons of ice, littered with discarded equipment and the frozen bodies of men and horses. He, Napoleon, the master strategist who could outmaneuver empires, finds his grand army paralyzed by snowflakes. This isn't an enemy that lines up for battle. It's an omnipresent, relentless force that requires no strategy, only endurance. And endurance is a finite resource against infinite cold. Men huddle together in desperate, futile attempts to share warmth, their breath turning instantly to frost. Each dawn reveals hundreds who did not survive the night, their forms rigid, etched against the white landscape. The drums of the Grande Armée are muffled by snow. The thunder of cannon is silenced by the howl of the wind. You see the lines of suffering etched not just on the faces of the soldiers, but on the commanders, who watch their commands dissolve into a struggle simply to stay alive. This is the stark, brutal truth of confronting nature when you believe your will is supreme. The insights promised by maps and battle plans offer no defense against a 20-degree below-zero wind chill. Napoleon, who had bent nations to his will, discovers the limits of ambition against fundamental physical reality. The irony is profound. His greatest victory, seizing Moscow, becomes the anvil upon which his army is broken, not by the Tsar's forces, but by the very ground he stood upon and the sky above. The promised supplies never arrive because the environment itself has become an impassable barrier. Ask yourself, was this merely bad luck or the inevitable consequence of a hubris so grand it blinded him to the most basic, non-negotiable enemy, the earth itself? What does it mean for a leader to respect the environment they operate in? This isn't just about winter. It's about geography, disease, natural resources. Ignoring these fundamental realities, believing your ambition or planning can overcome anything, invites catastrophe. The lesson sears itself into the historical record. The most brilliant human strategy crumbles to dust when it fails to account for the ground beneath your feet and the sky above your head. And here, in the brutal embrace of the white enemy, the Grande Armée is learning this lesson with every frozen step backward. The biting wind is a physical blow, stealing breath and hope. You are not marching now. You are shuffling, a million footsteps of despair on frozen ground. The once proud ranks of the Grande Armée are a shattered illusion. The structure, the iron discipline that forged an empire, is dissolving like mist in the harsh sun. Hunger gnaws from within, a constant, vicious companion. The cold penetrates marrow, freezing not just limbs, but the will to fight, to obey, to even be a soldier. Exhaustion is a heavy cloak, dragging men down into the snow, never to rise again. This is not retreat, it is dissolution. The bonds forged in victory, in shared hardship, in the very idea of serving the emperor, are snapping under the strain. Men drop their muskets, symbols of their identity, now just useless weight. They abandon their units, their officers, the very concept of a formation. They become primal creatures, eyes hollowed by starvation, focused only on the next scrap, the next flicker of warmth. You see them fighting now, not the enemy, but each other. A frozen potato, a stray horse carcass, a place by a meager, sputtering fire. These are the prizes of this new, terrible war. A shove, a desperate blow, the thin, rattling cry of a dying man. This is the new soundtrack of the Grande Armée. The marshals, your closest companions and commanders, stride through the chaos, their faces etched with futility. They shout orders, plead, threaten, but their voices are lost on the wind, drowned out by the shuffling feet and the whispers of desperation. Military law holds no sway here. The elemental forces of survival have replaced every decree, every regulation, every command. The soldiers who once cheered your name, who followed you through fire and snow, now look through you, if they look at all, their focus entirely inward. The army you built, piece by painstaking piece, with discipline, with glory, with the promise of plunder and prestige, is crumbling into a starving, desperate mob. This stark reality is a brutal lesson etched in the frozen landscape. It illustrates, with terrifying clarity, the fundamental fragility of order and discipline when the basic needs of those you lead are ignored. When you expose your people to unbearable suffering, when you starve them of food, of warmth, of hope, the intricate edifice of command collapses. Authority is not some abstract right granted by rank or title. It is a trust built on the foundation of welfare, on the perception of competent guidance, on the simple fact that you are seen to care, to provide. When that foundation crumbles, the structure cannot stand. The surprising, heartbreaking insight here is the sheer speed and totality with which the transformation occurs. One moment, they are soldiers, bound by oaths and training. The next, they are desperate animals, governed only by primal instinct. The leadership failure was not merely strategic, though that failure was immense. It was deeply human. You neglected the fundamental well-being of the men who were your strength, your sword, your empire. You exposed them to suffering beyond endurance, and in doing so, you did not just lose their loyalty. You destroyed the very organization you commanded from within. An army, you knew, marched on its stomach, but you forgot it also marched on its hope. You starved them of both, and the cost was paid not just in lives, but in the dissolution of the force itself. Ask yourself, is there any strategic gain, any ambition worth this level of human cost? This complete breakdown of the bonds that make us more than just struggling individuals? What does it mean to command when your people are reduced to this? You reach the Berezina River in late November. The landscape is a frozen wasteland, a white shroud over the graveyard of your grand campaign. The bridges are destroyed, shattered timber and ice where your escape route should be. Behind you, the pursuing Russian armies claw at your heels, a relentless storm closing in. Before you, an icy, formidable river, an impossible barrier that promises certain death for the exhausted, freezing remnants of the Grande Armée. This is the abyss. Survival hangs by the frailest thread. In a desperate, almost suicidal act of engineering and raw courage, your dedicated pontooniers, the Dutch and German heroes of General Jean-Baptiste Eble, begin building temporary bridges. For days, waist-deep in freezing water, working with frostbitten hands and under constant enemy artillery fire, these men perform miracles. They embody a loyalty and selflessness that defies belief, a stark contrast to the widespread despair and breakdown of discipline. Thousands pour across the fragile pontoons, a chaotic, desperate tide seeking the western bank. But many thousands more are trapped on the eastern side, their eyes fixed on the disappearing chance of survival. As the Russians finally attack in force, the scene devolves into unimaginable horror. Masses surge onto the crowded, unstable bridges, the icy timbers cracking under the weight. People fall through the gaps, swallowed by the freezing current below, their screams lost in the roar of cannons and the panic of the dying. It is a maelstrom of human suffering, a testament to the horrific cost of strategic failure. This desperate passage is not a victory, it is a brutal survival, paid for in the coin of unimaginable agony and sacrifice. It is here, in the absolute depths of ruin, that you witness both the best and the worst of human nature. You see soldiers sharing meager scraps or helping strangers across, and you see others trampling the weak to save themselves. The insight is stark. Crisis strips away pretense, revealing core character under the most intense pressure. Flickers of that initial genius, the ability to inspire, to achieve the impossible, are visible in the Pontonier's incredible feat. Yet, the moral takeaway burns with cold clarity. Resourcefulness and courage are vital, but a leader's primary goal must always be to avoid the catastrophic miscalculations that necessitate such desperate, costly heroics. The Berezina was a direct, gruesome consequence of underestimating the enemy, overextending power, and clinging to ambition beyond the point of reason. Ask yourself, is the leader who drives men to such desperate, glorious sacrifice truly great, or merely responsible for the ruin that demanded it? What nobility lies in surviving a self-inflicted catastrophe at the cost of thousands? December descends like a shroud. The skeletal remnants of the Grande Armée stumble westward, a ragged, frozen tide receding from the vast, indifferent plains of Russia. This is not an army. It is a collection of dying men, a testament to the brutal arithmetic of ambition. You stand amidst the wreckage, the sharp wind biting at your face, and you know the game here is over. The question isn't how to win, but how to salvage anything. A difficult decision crystallizes, cold and clear as the ice forming on the breath of your exhausted guard. You must leave them. You, the emperor, the Sun King of this collapsing empire, must depart the dying field. It's a calculation made not on a map of skirmishes, but on the vast, complex chessboard of Europe itself. You must return to Paris, raise a new army from the very soil of France, shore up your political position, which is surely trembling under the weight of this catastrophe, and ensure the empire does not crumble into dust while its core bleeds out thousands of miles away. The travel is swift, almost frantic, a jarring contrast to the agonizing crawl of your men. By sleigh, you race through the snow-laden landscapes, the speed a physical manifestation of the urgency pounding in your chest. You leave Marshal Murat, your brother-in-law, the King of Naples, in command, a heavy burden for even his flamboyant shoulders. You promise to return, a necessary lie perhaps, or a flicker of a hope you cannot yet relinquish. But the symbolism is stark, undeniable. The emperor departs the dying field, leaving his soldiers to the wolves and the frost. This act, even centuries later, ignites fierce debate. Was it pragmatic necessity, the only way to preserve the state and the possibility of future campaigns, the cold logic of a leader prioritizing the system over the individual components? Or was it the ultimate abandonment, a betrayal of the implicit covenant between commander and soldier, leaving the very men who had sacrificed everything for your glory to their fate? It reveals, in chilling detail, the complex, often ruthless calculation at the very heart of absolute power. Sometimes, perhaps often, preserving the system, or critically, preserving your own position as the linchpin of that system, demands the sacrifice of individuals within it. It is a brutal equation that many leaders face, though rarely on this scale, rarely with such visible, agonizing consequences. Consider this. What is the true measure of leadership? Is it staying rooted with your people through the absolute worst, sharing their suffering until the bitter end? Or is it ensuring the survival of the mission, the state, the larger cause, if it means making choices that abandon those you led? Your decision solidified your power base in France, allowing you to rebuild, to fight again. But it fractured, perhaps irrevocably, the myth of the leader who shared every hardship, every biscuit, every frozen night alongside his men. The human cost of your strategic mind is laid bare in the Russian snow. What would you have done, racing through the snow, the fate of an empire and the lives of hundreds of thousands weighing on you? Months later, the first of them begin to trickle back across the borders. They are not the Grande Armée that marched east with eagles soaring and banners bright. They are shadows, ghosts pulled from the frozen grip of Russia. You see them appear on the horizon, solitary figures, small groups, stumbling through the snow, their uniforms in tatters, little more than rags against the biting wind. Their faces are gaunt, etched with frostbite and a deep, unsettling emptiness. These are the survivors, a fraction of the million who went in. Look closely. Their feet are wrapped in scraps, their hands often bare or gloved in makeshift bindings. They carry no weapons, no standards of victory. What they carry, what they embody, is the silent, damning testament to a catastrophic failure. They are living monuments to the brutal reality of unchecked ambition. The grand design, the glorious invasion meant to cripple an empire, is reduced to these few thousand broken, traumatized men. This isn't just a military retreat. It's the physical manifestation of a strategic miscalculation. The maps and logistical charts, the abstract lines of advance and supply, crumble in the face of this human cost. The insight is stark and unforgiving. The true price of overreach is not just measured in territory lost or alliances shattered, but in the lives broken, frozen, and extinguished on distant snowscapes. Every strategic decision, every ambitious plan conceived in comfort or confidence, has a human cost that a leader must confront, not abstract away into numbers on a page. These aren't merely soldiers returning, they are living indictments. Each emaciated face, each missing limb, each vacant stare whispers of a failure of judgment at the very highest level. They are the cold, hard truth arriving on foot, undeniable and devastating. They force the uncomfortable question, what does leadership mean when the cost of your vision is tallied in the agony of thousands? How do you reconcile the pursuit of glory with the sight of your army reduced to phantoms? Ask yourself, if you stood here, watching these ghosts of men return, could you still see the strategic victory in the distance? Or would the human cost eclipse everything? The return from Russia strips away the veneer of glory and reveals the raw, bleeding heart of war's ultimate consequence. The Grande Armée, a name that once struck terror and awe across continents, stumbles back from the frozen void. But the bitter truth isn't just the shattered columns, the ghosts left behind in the snow. It's the sheer scale of the catastrophe, too vast, too absolute to conceal. Whispers begin in the courts of Europe, quiet at first, then growing into a chorus of disbelief, then daring hope. You survived Russia. Yes, you outran the worst of the Cossacks and the frost. You made it back to France to raise a new army. But the aura, the mystique of invincibility built over 15 years of relentless victory, that perished somewhere between Borodino and the Berezina. And Europe, the old Europe you had beaten down, rearranged like pieces on a chessboard, sees it. They see you, the Titan, vulnerable, bleeding men and reputation. This isn't just a military defeat, it's a psychological earthquake. Enemies you had crushed, kings you had humiliated, nations you had occupied or forced into reluctant alliance, they lift their heads. The weight of your perceived strength is gone, replaced by the intoxicating scent of opportunity. First comes the tremor, Prussia, your reluctant ally, bound by treaties signed under duress after Jena Auerstedt. King Frederick William III, hesitant and cautious by nature, feels the ground shifting beneath him. His people, smarting from years of French occupation and forced contributions, clamor for liberation. Suddenly, the impossible seems possible. General York, commanding the Prussian contingent in the Russian campaign, makes the crucial unilateral move. The Convention of Tauroggen. He signs an armistice with the Russians, effectively neutralizing his core and, more importantly, signaling Prussia's pivot. This isn't just a general acting alone. It's a litmus test for the king and the nation. They embrace York. Prussia deserts your alliance. This defection sends a shockwave. It legitimizes the idea of resistance. If Prussia, right on France's doorstep, dares to defy you after Russia, who else might? All eyes turn to Vienna. Austria, your longtime rival, twice humiliated and dismantled, now ruled in large part by your own father-in-law, Emperor Francis I. His wily minister, Metternich, watches with clinical precision. Austria had sent an army corps to aid you in Russia, a half-hearted gesture designed to maintain neutrality while placating you. But Metternich is a master strategist of realpolitik, not sentiment. He sees the numbers, the corpses in Russia, the depleted French youth you're now conscripting. He sees the opportunity for Austria to reclaim its place at the center of European power, not as a vassal or ally, but as a crucial, independent force, potentially holding the balance of power. Their contingent under Schwarzenberg also pivots, signing their own armistice with the Russians. They don't immediately declare war, but they step back, offering mediation, building their own army, waiting for the opportune moment to join the gathering storm. The coalition is forming anew, more determined, more unified than ever before. Consider the sheer speed of this unraveling. Months ago, you stood in Moscow, the undisputed master of the continent. Now, your most important allies abandon you, sensing blood in the water. The war is no longer a grand strategic game played out on distant foreign soil, where you dictate the terms and surprise your foes. The consequences of Russia are following you home. The armies of Europe, no longer scattered and isolated, are converging. The fight will be in Germany, potentially in France itself. This is the brutal lesson of perceived power. It exists only as long as others believe in it. Your reputation for invincibility was your shield. The Russian snow melted it away. The financial cost, the human toll, immense. But the shattering of your aura, that is the wound that cannot be healed, the one that invites the wolves to the door. How much of your dominance was military genius, and how much was the sheer weight of the idea of Napoleon, the unstoppable force? Ask yourself, when does confidence tip over into a blind spot for catastrophe? And what happens when the world stops being afraid? The plains stretch out, no longer just a battlefield, but the final, desperate stage. The campaigns of 1813 and 1814 unfold like a tragedy written in mud and blood. You return from the abyss of Russia, not defeated outright, but wounded in a way that history will soon prove mortal. You find yourselves surrounded by a new reality. Your once invincible Grande Armée is a ghost. The soldiers who march now are boys, pulled from the furthest corners of the empire, brave perhaps, but lacking the hardened steel and shared history of the veterans lost to the Russian snows. Yet, flashes of the old brilliance ignite. You win battles at Lutzen and Botzen in 1813. Tactical masterpieces that echo the glory days. The enemy reels, but they do not break, not anymore. These are victories, yes, but they are hollow. You can no longer deliver the crushing, decisive knockout blow that shattered coalitions at Austerlitz or Jena. The reason is brutally simple. A dual vice tightening around you. Your armies are younger, less experienced. The machine is sputtering, and crucially, your enemies are more numerous, more determined, and finally, united. This unity is the poison you never expected them to swallow, the strategic counterstroke that defeats your greatest diplomatic weapon, sowing discord among your foes. What follows is a relentless, grinding pressure. The Allies, no longer fearful of a single devastating defeat, simply absorb your blows and keep coming. You are fighting not just armies, but the collective will of a continent you have exhausted and alienated. The path leads inevitably to the colossal Battle of the Nations at Leipzig in October 1813. Here, the sheer weight of numbers crushes your inexperienced lines. It is a defeat of unprecedented scale, forcing you back towards the borders of France itself. The invasion of 1814 is a bitter, desperate defensive campaign fought on your own soil, a cruel twist of fate for the man who spent 2 decades conquering others. You fight with the ferocity of a cornered wolf, winning smaller engagements, displaying tactical genius against overwhelming odds. But the strategic reality is inescapable. The wound from Russia festers. It has drained your resources, emboldened your enemies, and shattered the myth of invincibility among your own people. They see the enemy camps across the fields they once considered sacrosanct. The pressure is unyielding, day after day, retreat after retreat. It culminates not on a glorious battlefield, but in the quiet, humiliating halls of Fontainebleau in April 1814, where the pen replaces the sword. The abdication is the bitter fruit of the seeds sown years before in Moscow's ashes. It wasn't just a military retreat. It was the political and moral turning point that sealed your fate. The leadership insight here is stark. Momentum and power is crucial. Once lost, it is incredibly difficult to regain, especially when facing a unified opposition that has learned from your every move. Ask yourself, was the failure of 1814 merely bad luck, or the inevitable downstream consequence of strategic overreach born of arrogance? The retreat from Moscow was not the end, but it was the unrecoverable wound from which your empire would bleed out. You lost the initiative, and the Allies, finally united, never gave it back. You sit on a windswept island, the boundless ocean a cruel mirror to a life once without bounds. Elba first, a temporary stage, then the final rock, St. Helena. The narrative arc of your existence unfolds in memory. The impossible heights scaled, the continent remade with pen and sword, the very fabric of European society torn and rewoven. Yet the shadow lengthens, cast by the millions lost, the insatiable reach that always demanded more, the ultimate collapse of everything built, the principle, stark and unforgiving, the campaign that broke not just an army, but the illusion of invincibility. A catastrophic march, driven by ambition, deaf to counsel, blind to reality, convinced that past triumphs guaranteed future ones. It is a timeless parable, isn't it? Written not in ink, but in blood and snow. The ultimate victory is never in how far you can push, but in understanding the precipice, knowing when and where the edge lies. Look around, even now. How many leaders, corporations, nations, careers march across their own symbolic Niemen every day? Vast in their confidence, driven by momentum, utterly convinced of their strategic brilliance, yet oblivious to the scorching earth tactics of reality, the inevitable coming winter. The human cost, often the first casualty, is simply a statistic in the grand strategy. Your story, Napoleon, is a chilling, perpetual reminder. History may grant immense power, but reality imposes absolute limits. To ignore those limits, to believe in your own exceptionalism beyond the laws of cause and effect, is not just an error in judgment. It is an invitation to exile, not merely from a throne, but from the possibility of sustainable greatness. You knew it in the end, didn't you? Reflecting on that devastating retreat, perhaps, when you uttered those haunting words, "From the sublime to the ridiculous is but a single step." Russia was that step, a terrifying, dizzying fall from the zenith of power into the abyss of consequence, a perpetual warning etched in the snow, not just for emperors, but for anyone who would seek to command their world without acknowledging its boundaries. The grand lesson of your fall, stripped bare on this isolated rock, is the brutal clarity that power unchecked does not lead to ultimate freedom, but to ultimate confinement. The wisdom history offers, often cruelly delivered, is that true strength lies not just in the will to conquer, but in the humility to understand and respect the unyielding force of reality. It wasn't just armies that defeated you in the end, Napoleon. It was believing you could conquer the very limits of ambition itself.